Our word of the week this week and for the next several weeks comes from a suggestion from friend of the channel, Steve. He wanted to see some words that have different meanings but not different constructions necessarily, depending on the context in which they're used. And the first one that we're going to look at, not unironically, is the word first, protos. So we're going to take a look at 6 uses that are different based on the context in which they're used. And first up, protos, first. We are looking at Matthew 21:31 with the Koine supplied from the ESV. Which of the two did the will of his father? They said, the first, ho protos. Jesus said to them, truly I say to you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes go into the kingdom of God before you. So this is the parable of the 2 sons. Jesus finishes telling the parable and asks which one of the 2 sons did the will of the father. The one who said, yes, I will, but didn't, or the one who said, I don't want to do that, but ultimately did what his father asked. And they answered, the first. So there's 2 sons. This could either mean the first in birth order or the first that the father approached and talked to. We're not told because he could have used the word the older one or the elder one, but he didn't. So he used the word first. So it could mean either one, or if in fact the first one he approached was the older of the 2 boys, it would mean both, right? But here it's not clear. All we know for sure is one of the 2 sons is tagged as the first, and the other of the 2 sons is not called the second, but is called heteros, the other one. Pretty cool stuff. Let's go on to Philippians chapter 1, verses 3 through 5, and our word is in verse 5. I thank my God in all my remembrance of you always in every prayer of mine for you all, making my prayer with joy, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first day until now. So here we have our word of the week, the first day. Apo tes protes hemeras archi tu nun. So apo tes protes, from the first, hemeras, of days, from the first days, archi, until tu nun, now, until now. So when he says the first days, he's obviously talking about the early days of the church in Philippi, right? He's not talking about creation, because they weren't partners in the gospel from creation. He's talking about the early days of Christianity coming to Philippi. So it's being used figuratively to talk about a period of time in the past. Next up, Matthew 20, verse 10. And here we're looking at an ordinal use of first. Now when those hired first, hoi protoi, came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received a denarius. So this is the parable of the workers who get called to work in the vineyard at different times during the course of the day, and at the end of the day, the people who came first, ho protoi, the ones who had been called to labor first, assumed they would get a larger payment than the ones who came later in the day, and they were disappointed. And they're called hoi protoi, the first ones. And so with several groups to choose from, this is ordinal use of first, the first ones called out of several groups. Next up, Matthew 27:64. Therefore, order the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people he has risen from the dead. And the last fraud will be worse than the first. And the first here is tes protes, just like Philippians 1:5. Tes protes, the first. So what does he mean here? It's a figurative use to describe an earlier event. What is the earlier event? He says if they're allowed to claim that he rose from the dead, that last fraud will be worse than the first. And in his mind, the first fraud, the earlier fraud, was convincing people that he in fact was the Messiah. So he convinced them that he was the Messiah. If they're allowed to steal away his body and claim he rose from the dead, that fraud will be worse than the earlier fraud. So here, protes is being used figuratively to describe something that was earlier. Next up, we're looking at Acts 22 and 23, just talking about being the first from among the dead. To this day I have had the help that comes from God, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great, saying nothing but what the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that by being the first, proto, to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Gentiles. So here, proto is talking about primacy, not temporally the first, not chronologically the first, because others were raised from the dead prior to Christ being raised from the dead. So he is proto, he is the primary one raised from the dead, because by virtue of the resurrection of Christ, all other resurrections are possible. All future resurrections, the promise of the resurrection of the faithful is only possible because of the resurrection of Christ. So his resurrection becomes the primary resurrection. Not the chronologically first, but the primary. And finally, we're going to look at an example of first in the question of degree. And this is Matthew 6:33 from the Sermon on the Mount. But seek first, proton, the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. So in your life, you will seek more than one thing. But Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew says, but above all other things, in the first place, primarily, when it comes to a question of degrees of the things you might seek, at the pinnacle is the kingdom of God. Seek first, primarily, at the pinnacle of the highest degree, the kingdom of God, and all the other stuff will be added to you. So there we have 6 nuances of protos, not determined by the grammar, but determined by the context. And there are plenty more of them, so feel free to dig in, look for the uses of the word protos, different forms of the word protos, and look at how the meaning is governed by the context, the situation in which it's being used. Thanks, Steve, for the great idea. There'll be more of these coming up for the next several words of the week. Leave me some feedback in the comments, all of you, please. Like, share, subscribe, hit the little notification dinger so you know when there's new content. And until next time, Charis Kairene Humin, grace and peace to you.